I remember the exact moment it all began to crumble. The clock on my phone blinked 2:34 a.m. as I fumbled with the keys outside our front door. The crisp night air still clung to my skin, heavy with the scent of spilled drinks and stale perfume. From the bar, my head buzzed, not just from the cocktails I'd lost count of, but from the sheer chaos of the evening. It wasn't supposed to go like this. I wasn't supposed to be the last one standing at the party, laughing too loudly, dancing too freely, forgetting entirely about the promise I'd made to him. "I won't be late," I'd said as I left the house that evening. My words felt hollow now, even to me. The door creaked as I stepped inside, the warm light from the living room spilling across the hardwood floors like a silent reprimand. He was there, sitting on the couch, his posture rigid, his jaw set in that way it always was when he was trying not to let his emotions show. He didn't look at me immediately, but I could feel the weight of his disapproval even in the silence. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as I placed my purse on the counter. "You're up," I said, my voice cracking slightly under the tension. He looked at me then, finally, his eyes meeting mine with a cool detachment that sent a shiver down my spine. "Of course I'm up," he said, his tone flat but cutting. "How could I not be?" I wanted to say something, anything, to diffuse the tension, but words felt clumsy and inadequate in the face of his disappointment. Instead, I tried to smile, to brush it off with a casual shrug. "It was just a late night," I said, hoping the flippancy in my tone would somehow smooth over the jagged edges of this moment. "No big deal." He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "No big deal," he repeated, each word heavy with disbelief. "You told me you'd be home by midnight, and then you stopped answering your phone. Do you even care how that looks? How it makes me feel?" The accusation in his words stung, but I felt my defenses rise almost instinctively. "It wasn't like that," I said quickly, stepping forward as if closing the distance between us would somehow lessen the weight of the argument. "I was with the girls, and things just got a little carried away. I didn't mean to worry you." He let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head as if my explanation only proved his point. "Do you hear yourself? You didn't mean to worry me? You didn't mean to—" He cut himself off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You know what? It doesn't even matter. I'm done trying to explain how your actions affect us, how they affect me." His words hit like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I was too stunned to respond. I'd expected anger, maybe even an argument, but this cold detachment, this quiet resignation, was something else entirely. "Wait," I said, my voice rising slightly in panic. "You're overreacting. It was one night. I wasn't out doing anything wrong. You're blowing this way out of proportion." But he wasn't looking at me anymore. Instead, he stood and walked toward the hallway, his back to me as he spoke over his shoulder. "I'm not overreacting. I'm just done pretending this doesn't bother me." I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the sound of his retreating footsteps echoed through the house. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 excuses, 1,000 ways to justify myself, but none of them felt adequate. Instead, all I could do was stand there, staring at the empty space he'd left behind, my chest tight with a suffocating mixture of guilt, frustration, and fear. The night wasn't supposed to end like this. I wasn't supposed to feel like this, like I was losing something I didn't even realize I'd been holding on to too tightly. As the minutes stretched into hours, I found myself replaying the evening in my mind, searching for the moment where everything had gone wrong. But no matter how hard I tried, all I could see was his face, etched with disappointment and something far worse, indifference. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faint smudges of condensation on my glass of water, the room eerily quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. My mind churned, replaying every word, every look, every gesture that passed between us in those few minutes. I wanted to believe it was just a fight, one of those late-night arguments fueled by exhaustion and misunderstandings. Couples argue. It's normal, right? But something about the way he walked away felt different this time, final in a way that made my stomach twist. He wasn't just angry, he was done. And I couldn't decide if I was furious at him for overreacting or terrified that I'd really crossed a line I couldn't come back from. I checked my phone, scrolling through the messages I'd sent him earlier in the evening. "The girls convinced me to stay for another drink. Don't wait up." The cheery tone made me cringe now, my face hot with shame. He hadn't responded to that one, or the one after that, sent when the music was so loud I barely heard myself. Think, "Sorry, service sucks here. Love you. Home soon." I should have called. I knew that. But at the time, it felt easier not to. Easier to lean into the laughter, the music, the fleeting sense of freedom that felt so rare these days. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about me, about proving to myself that I could still be the fun one, the carefree one, the one people wanted to be around. And yet, now that I sat here in the quiet of our shared home, the weight of my choices settled over me like a lead blanket. When the bedroom door finally creaked open around sunrise, I straightened, instinctively smoothing the creases on my shirt, as though that would somehow make me appear more composed. He walked out dressed for work, his tie knotted perfectly, his hair neatly combed. He looked as though he hadn't lost a single minute of sleep, but the tightness around his eyes told a different story. "Hey," I said softly, my voice tentative. He didn't look at me. He just poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements methodical and precise. "Can we talk?" I asked, standing slowly, my palms pressing flat against the table. He finally turned to face me, his eyes hard and unreadable. "Talk about what?" he said, his tone sharp enough to slice through the air. I feel like we left things unfinished last night," I stammered, hating how small and unsure I sounded. "I don't want to fight with you." "Funny," he said with a bitter edge, "because it seems like you don't care at all about what I want. If you did, you wouldn't keep doing things like this." My chest tightened, and I took a step toward him. "That's not fair," I protested. "I'm allowed to have a life too. I didn't do anything wrong." He laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "You think this is about you having a life? This is about trust, respect, two things you clearly don't think I deserve." The words hit me like a slap, and I flinched. "That's not true," I said, my voice cracking. "You're twisting this into something it's not. It was one night." "Was it?" he shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "Because it doesn't feel like one night. It feels like a pattern of you putting yourself first and me second." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Was he wrong? I wanted to say yes, to fight back, to defend myself, but the truth was murkier than I wanted to admit. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Intent doesn't matter. Not when the outcome is always the same." And just like that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing there, clutching the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping me upright. The sound of his car pulling out of the driveway felt like a door slamming shut in my chest. I sank back into the chair, my hands trembling as I buried my face in them. This was more than a fight. I could feel it now, a cold certainty creeping in around the edges of my denial. This was the beginning of the end. Or maybe, if I was honest with myself, it was simply the culmination of cracks that had been forming for months, years even, beneath the surface of what I'd convinced myself was a solid foundation. And I didn't know how to fix it, or if I even could. The hours crawled by after he left. I stayed at the table, unmoving, as the light outside shifted from pale gray to golden. The house felt unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to press down on you, amplifying every creak, every hum of the world moving on without you. I thought about texting him, apologizing, something, anything. But every time I picked up my phone, my thumb hovered uselessly over the screen. What was I supposed to say? That I was sorry? That it wouldn't happen again? Even if I meant it, and I did, how could he believe me after last night? My mind wandered back to the party, replaying the night in vivid, almost mocking clarity. The thrum of bass so loud it shook the walls. The sugary tang of margaritas that went down too easily. The laughter, the dancing, the way I'd lost track of time entirely. It had felt so freeing then, like a fleeting escape from the monotony of work, bills, errands, and a marriage that had started to feel like another box to check off on my endless to-do list. But now, in the light of day, it felt like betrayal. Not because I'd done anything wrong. There were no secrets, no hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. It was just the carelessness of it all. The way I'd dismissed his feelings without a second thought, brushing off his texts as if they were just another obligation instead of a plea for reassurance. I thought about how we'd gotten here, to this point where even a single late night could unravel everything. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when we were inseparable, when I'd have chosen staying in with him over any party, any distraction. But somewhere along the way, the shine had worn off, leaving behind a dull, grinding kind of routine. It wasn't his fault, not entirely. He tried in his own way, with the little things, a bouquet of flowers on a random Tuesday, a spontaneous date night planned without prompting. But instead of feeling grateful, I'd felt resentful. Resentful that he could still find joy in those moments while I felt trapped by them. The sound of the front door unlocking jolted me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat as he stepped inside, his face unreadable. He carried a stack of papers under one arm, his tie loosened slightly, his posture stiff. "You're back," I said, my voice uncertain. "Just for a minute," he replied curtly, his tone making it clear this wasn't a homecoming. He walked past me into the living room, setting the papers down on the coffee table with an air of finality that made my stomach twist. "What's that?" I asked, standing and following him. He turned to face me, his expression cold. "Paperwork," he said simply. "For what?" My voice was shaky now, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself. "For a divorce," he said, the words falling from his lips like stones. I stared at him, uncomprehending. "What? No, you don't mean that. We had a fight, but it's not that bad." "It is," he said firmly. "It's been bad for a long time, even if you don't want to admit it." Panic surged through me, and I reached for his arm, desperate to anchor myself to something real. "Please, don't do this," I begged, my voice breaking. "We can fix it." "I'll fix it. Just give me a chance." He shook his head, his eyes full of something that looked like sadness, but felt like resolve. "I've given you chances, more than I can count. But nothing changes. You keep pushing me away, and I can't keep pretending that it doesn't hurt. I can't keep doing this." Tears streamed down my face as I tried to find the right words, the ones that would make him stay. "I know I've messed up," I said, my voice trembling. "I know I've taken you for granted, but I love you. Doesn't that count for something?" "It used to," he said quietly, "but love isn't enough when the respect is gone. And honestly, I don't think you even love me. Not really. You love the idea of me, the safety I bring, but you don't love me." His words hit harder than I thought they would, cutting through my defenses and leaving me raw and exposed. "That's not true," I whispered, though even I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. He didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his keys and walked toward the door, pausing only long enough to say, "I'll be back for my things this weekend. You should take some time to think about what you really want." And then he was gone. Again. I sank onto the couch, clutching a throw pillow like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. The stack of papers on the coffee table seemed to mock me, a physical manifestation of everything I'd ignored, dismissed, and let slip away. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something, but all I could do was sit there, staring at the spot where he'd stood, feeling the weight of what I'd lost settle over me like a suffocating blanket. The weekend came too quickly, and with it, the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. I'd spent the past 2 days oscillating between panic and numbness, alternating between frantic cleaning sprees and staring blankly at the ceiling as if some revelation might appear there. I'd reread the papers at least a dozen times, my eyes lingering on every cold, clinical phrase, irretrievable breakdown of marriage. Each word felt like a stab, draining the life out of something I'd spent years trying to build. Now he was here to take the last of his things. I stood in the hallway as the door opened, bracing myself for his presence. He walked in with that same composed, distant expression he'd worn the last time I saw him. He didn't look at me as he passed, heading straight to the bedroom. "I didn't know if you'd come," I said, my voice brittle against the silence. He didn't stop, didn't turn. "I told you I would," he said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. I followed him, my bare feet padding softly against the floor as I struggled to find the words that would make him stay. Watching him pack up his life, our life, felt surreal. Every shirt he folded, every book he slipped into a box, chipped away at the fragile hope I'd been clinging to. "You're really doing this?" I asked, the tremor in my voice betraying the calm I was trying to project. He didn't look up as he answered. "I don't see another option." "That's it, then? You're just giving up?" That made him pause. He set down the sweater he'd been folding and turned to face me. "Giving up?" he repeated, his voice edged with incredulity. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I want this?" "Then why are you doing it?" I shot back, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "If you don't want to leave, then don't. Stay. We can work through this. We always do." He shook his head slowly, his expression a mix of sadness and resignation. "That's the problem, though, isn't it? We always do this. We fight, we apologize, we promise to do better, and then nothing changes. I can't keep living in this cycle, waiting for the next blow-up, the next disappointment." I swallowed, hard, my throat tight with unshed tears. "I'll change," I said, my voice breaking. "I mean it this time. I'll—" "Stop," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't make promises you can't keep. I've heard it all before, and maybe I wanted to believe it back then, but now I just can't." "Why not?" I demanded, the desperation clawing its way out. "Why can't you believe me? Why can't you give me one more chance?" "Because I don't have anything left to give," he said softly, the weight of his words crushing. The air left my lungs in a shuddering gasp, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. It was the kind that came from years of trying and failing, from pouring yourself into something that never seemed to be enough. "Do you even love me anymore?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, and the pause was like a knife. To the chest. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice raw. "I think I love who we used to be. I think I love the idea of us. But the reality? I don't know how to love this version of us. Of you." I took a step back as if his words had physically struck me. My legs felt weak, my vision blurry. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," I said, the tears flowing freely now. I didn't know how to make it better." "Neither did I," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I can't keep waiting for things to fix themselves. I've been waiting for a long time, and it's only made things worse." He turned back to the suitcase, zipping it closed with a finality that echoed in my ears. I wanted to scream, to grab his arm, to beg him to stay, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. The moment was gone, lost in all the moments I hadn't fought hard enough for before. When he finally left, the house felt emptier than I'd ever thought possible. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him was like a gunshot, reverberating through the hollow spaces he'd left behind. I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of everything crashing down on me at once. I wanted to blame him for leaving, for not fighting harder, for not forgiving me. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about one wild night or one late party. This was about all the little choices I'd made, all the times I'd taken him for granted, all the ways I'd let the distance between us grow without ever trying to bridge it. And now, as I sat there in the quiet of the life I'd built and broken, I realized the most painful truth of all. I'd done this to myself. The days after he left blurred together into a hollow monotony. I went through the motions, waking up, going to work, coming home, but everything felt muted, like I was watching my own life from behind a pane of glass. The silence in the house was unbearable, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, instinctively typing out messages to him before stopping short. What could I even say? Words felt useless now, hollow apologies that wouldn't undo the damage I'd caused. I reread the last text he'd sent me weeks ago before all of this began. Drive safe, love you. The simplicity of it twisted the knife deeper. It wasn't just the loss of him, it was the loss of the version of me that existed when we were together. With him, I'd felt anchored, even when I didn't realize it. Now I was untethered, adrift in a sea of my own choices, my own regrets. I tried to distract myself. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors and reorganizing closets as if erasing his presence would somehow make it hurt less. I went out with friends, forcing myself to laugh at their jokes and drink just enough to numb the ache in my chest. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the emptiness. One night, I found myself sitting on the floor of the bedroom we used to share, surrounded by the few things he'd left behind. A stray sock, a paperback novel with the spine cracked from use, the cologne bottle he kept on the dresser. I picked up the book and flipped through it absently, the pages falling open to a dog-eared corner. There, in his handwriting, was a note. In the margin, "Sometimes love isn't enough if it's not nourished." The words stopped me cold. I stared at them for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Was this about us? Had he been trying to tell me something all along, and I just hadn't seen it? I thought about all the times I'd dismissed him, brushed off his concerns, taken his love for granted. I'd convinced myself that love was enough, that as long as we loved each other, we could weather anything. But I hadn't nurtured that love. I'd let it wither, suffocated by my own insecurities and selfishness. The realization hit me like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. I had failed him, not just in the big ways, but in the countless little ones, the missed moments, the unspoken apologies, the times I chose my pride over our connection. I sat there, clutching the book, and let the tears come. They weren't the desperate, pleading tears I'd cried when he left. These were quieter, heavier, born from the weight of acceptance. The next morning, I made coffee for one and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers I still hadn't signed. My pen hovered over the signature line, trembling. Part of me wanted to fight, to cling to the hope that I could fix this, that we could find our way back to each other. But another part of me, a quieter, more honest part, knew that signing these papers wasn't just about letting him go. It was about letting go of the person I'd been, the one who had contributed to our undoing. I set the pen down without signing. Not because I wasn't ready to let go of him, but because I wasn't ready to let go of the possibility of becoming better. For him. For myself. That evening, I wrote him a letter. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but there are things I need to say, things I should have said long ago. I'm sorry. For all of it, for the late nights, the carelessness, the times I made you feel like you weren't enough. You were always enough. I wasn't. I don't expect this to change anything. I don't expect forgiveness or a second chance. But I need you to know that I see now what I couldn't see before. You deserved more than I gave, and I hope you find someone who can love you the way you deserve. Thank you for loving me, even when I made it hard. I'll carry that with me, always. I sealed the envelope and left it on the counter, unsure if I'd ever actually send it. Maybe it wasn't for him. Maybe it was for me, a way to finally confront the truth I'd been avoiding. As I sat there, the quiet didn't feel quite as suffocating as it had before. For the first time, it felt like something else, a space to rebuild, to grow. a space to start again, even if it was only for myself. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of old habits, forced by necessity rather than choice. The silence of the house that once felt so stifling became a mirror, reflecting back everything I had tried to ignore. I filled the emptiness with things I had once brushed aside, books I'd always meant to read, recipes I'd bookmarked but never tried, long walks with no destination. It wasn't a transformation, not in the way movies or stories would have you believe. It was messy, uneven, full of starts and stops. Some days I felt like I was making progress, like I was finally starting to understand what had gone wrong and how I could change. Other days I barely had the energy to get out of bed, my thoughts spiraling into the familiar cycle of blame and regret. I didn't hear from him. I told myself I didn't expect to, but every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt in spite of myself. It was always something mundane, a reminder to pay a bill, a text from a friend checking in, a notification about a sale I didn't care about. Still, I couldn't bring myself to delete his contact. One afternoon, I found myself in the coffee shop where we used to go on lazy Sunday mornings. The barista didn't recognize me. It had been months since we'd last been there together, but the familiarity of the place was comforting in its own way. I sat at a corner table, sipping my latte and flipping through a notebook I'd started carrying with me everywhere. I'd never been the journaling type, but after he left, the words had started pouring out of me, messy and unfiltered. At first, it was just a way to vent, to make sense of the chaos in my head, but over time, it became something more, a way to understand myself, to untangle the web of emotions and mistakes that had led to this point. As I flipped through the pages, a sentence I'd written weeks ago caught my eye. I always expected him to save me from myself. It was a harsh truth, one I hadn't been ready to face when I'd scribbled it down in a moment of clarity. But now, it felt like the key to everything. I'd spent so much of our relationship relying on him to fill the gaps in me, to fix the things I didn't want to face. And when he couldn't or wouldn't, it had been easier to blame him than to confront my own shortcomings. I closed the notebook and stared out the window, watching the people passing by. Couples holding hands, parents wrangling toddlers, someone walking their dog. They all seemed so absorbed in their own lives, their own stories, completely unaware of mine. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. Hope. Not the desperate, clawing hope of wanting him back, but the quieter, steadier hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to be whole on my own. That evening, I pulled out the divorce papers again. This time, the weight of them didn't feel quite so unbearable. I read through them carefully, letting the finality of it sink in, and then I signed my name. The next day, I called his lawyer and arranged to have the papers delivered. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was just something that needed to be done. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, as if I'd finally closed a door that had been creaking on its hinges for far too long. A few days later, I received a text from him. "Got the papers, thank you. I hope you're doing okay." It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring a lump to my throat. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing out a response. "I'm trying. I hope you are too." His reply came quickly. "I am." That was it. Just 2 words, but they carried a weight of their own. I didn't press for more, didn't try to rekindle something that was already gone. Instead, I set my phone down and went back to my notebook, writing until the words stopped coming. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward, step by small step. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine. And that, I realized, was a start. Months passed, marked not by milestones, but by small, quiet changes. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. I'd rearranged the furniture, painted the walls a softer color, and filled the shelves with books and plants that brought me some semblance of peace. It wasn't about erasing him. It was about making the space my own. Work became a refuge, a place where I could focus on something outside myself. I threw myself into projects, stayed late, and volunteered for things I never would have before. At first, it was just a way to keep busy, to fill the hours that stretched endlessly before me. But over time, I started to rediscover a sense of purpose. The loneliness didn't go away entirely. There were still nights when the silence pressed down on me, when I'd wake up from dreams of him and reach for a warmth that wasn't there. But those moments became less frequent, less consuming. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, smiling on a hike we'd taken years ago, our arms wrapped around each other as the sun set behind us. Another photo showed him laughing at a backyard barbecue, his face lit up in a way that made my chest ache. I couldn't bring myself to delete them, but I didn't dwell on them either. Instead, I closed the album and set my phone aside, choosing to focus on the present. It was around that time that I decided to send the letter. The one I'd written weeks ago and left untouched on the counter. It wasn't about rekindling anything or even seeking closure. It was about offering something I'd never fully given him before: honesty. I mailed it without expectations, and once it was out of my hands, I felt lighter. Whether he read it or not didn't matter as much as the act of writing it had. It was my way of acknowledging the past while letting it go. 2 weeks later, I received a response. A single envelope in the mail, his handwriting instantly recognizable on the front. My heart raced as I opened it, unfolding the neatly written note inside. "Thank you for the letter. It meant more than you know. I'm glad to hear you're finding your way. I am too. Take care of yourself. Always." There was no bitterness, no blame, just a simple kindness that left me both relieved and sorrowful. I traced the words with my fingers, tears slipping down my cheeks, not out of regret, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for what we'd had, for what we'd learned, and for the fact that we could part with this quiet understanding. From that moment, something shifted in me. I stopped looking backwards so much and started focusing on what lay ahead. I signed up for a painting class at a local community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. I started running in the mornings, letting the crisp air clear my mind. One morning, as I jogged through the park, I passed a couple sitting on a bench. They were laughing, their heads close together, and for a moment, a pang of longing shot through me. But it wasn't for him, not exactly. It was for the feeling of connection, of sharing something real with someone. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of love anymore. I wasn't afraid of failing either. What scared me was the idea of not trying, of closing myself off because of what had happened. That evening, I wrote another letter. This one wasn't for him. It was for me. I listed all the things I wanted to do, all the ways I wanted to grow. I promised myself I wouldn't let the past define me, that I would keep moving forward, no matter how uncertain the path might be. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The months continued to pass, each day feeling like another small piece of myself being rebuilt. The healing wasn't linear. Some days were easier than others. There were still moments when I found myself pausing in the middle of something, a sudden memory or feeling taking me by surprise. But I learned to let those moments come and go without letting them dominate my life. One Saturday, I stood in front of the mirror, examining the reflection that had changed so much over the past year. My face still carried the traces of the old me, the woman who had clung to him, the woman who had blamed herself for everything. But there was something new there, too. It wasn't a transformation so much as an unveiling. The woman staring back at me was softer, more confident in her solitude. She didn't need anyone to complete her anymore. I was enough, and it took me a long time to realize that. The phone rang and I almost didn't answer it, but when I saw his name pop up on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. It had been months since we'd last spoken, and the fact that he was calling sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hello?" "Hey, it's me." His voice came through, steady, but a little hesitant. I could almost hear him bracing himself, unsure of how I would react. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I leaned back against the kitchen counter, feeling a strange mix of emotions. I'm doing okay. A lot better than I was, I think." "Good," he said softly. I've been thinking about you, about everything. I didn't know what to say to that. My mind spun with 1,000 possible responses, each one carrying a different weight. You're okay, though? I finally asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Yeah, he replied, a small laugh escaping him. I am. It's been hard, but I think I'm figuring things out. There was a silence between us, one that felt less awkward than the ones we'd shared in the months before. It wasn't filled with anger or regret. It was simply a pause, a moment to acknowledge that things had changed. I'm glad, I said, surprising myself with the sincerity in my voice. Really glad. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, the apology I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for quietly slipping into the conversation. I know, I answered, my voice steadier than I expected. And I didn't want to hurt you either. There was a long pause, one that hung in the air, both of us wrestling with the weight of the past, yet somehow feeling lighter in the shared space between us. I think we both needed to go through what we went through, I continued, the words flowing more easily now. Not to justify anything, but I think it helped us figure out who we are, without each other. Yeah, he agreed softly. I've thought about that too, about what I need, what I want. We spoke for a while longer, small talk mingling, with more personal revelations, but as the conversation drew to a close, I felt a strange peace settling within me. I hope you're happy, I said, the words carrying a weight of meaning that only time could have given me. I hope you are too, he replied, his voice genuine, almost wistful. Take care of yourself, okay? You too, I said, smiling softly to myself. When the call ended, I stood there for a long while, staring at the phone in my hand. There had been no grand reconciliation, no promises made or broken. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Again. Not because of him or because of anything that had happened between us, but because I had finally come to terms with it all. I had let him go, and in doing so, I had let myself go too. I had learned to live for me. In the weeks that followed, life felt like it was starting to bloom again. I took up new hobbies, spent more time with friends, and began to explore the quiet joy of being alone, of not needing anyone else to define me. It was strange at first, this new freedom. But it didn't take long to find comfort in the silence, in the stillness. One afternoon, while sitting at a park bench reading a book I'd picked up on a whim, I found myself smiling. Not because I had everything figured out, but because I no longer needed to. There was something beautiful in the uncertainty, in the open-ended possibility of life. And as the sun set, casting a soft glow over everything around me, I realized that I was okay. More than okay. I was whole. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes the hardest part isn't letting go of someone else. It's letting go of the person you used to be. The months turned into seasons, and I continued to move forward, each day a step further from the woman I had been. Time, as it always does, helped to ease the sharper edges of my past, but it never fully erased them. There were still days when the loneliness crept back in, slow and insidious, like a familiar shadow that seemed to always follow me. But I had learned to make peace with it, to let it exist without letting it consume me. One night, as winter began to settle in, I found myself at the old coffee shop again, the same place where we had once shared countless mornings, the place where he had first held my hand and whispered sweet things to me. It felt different now, though. Not painful, just different. The ghosts of the past had faded, and in their place was something new, something that didn't require me to constantly look over my shoulder, wondering if I was moving in the right direction. I sat at the same corner table where we had always sat, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly as I watched the world move around me. People came and went, absorbed in their own conversations and lives. I was no longer part of the crowd, but I was also no longer on the outside. I had found my place in it all, quietly confident in my own skin. As I sat there, lost in the warmth of my thoughts, I noticed someone standing at the counter, their face half hidden behind a scarf. They ordered their drink, then turned and caught my eye. It took a moment before I realized who it was. He stood there, looking just the same, though there was a certain weariness to him that hadn't been there before. He looked older, not in years, but in the way life had started to shape him. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. Neither of us moved. Finally, he took a step forward, as if pulled by an invisible thread. "Hi," he said, his voice a little rougher than I remembered. "Hi," I replied, my heart thudding a little faster in my chest. I wasn't sure what to say next. The silence stretched between us, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt natural, as if we had both been waiting for this moment in our own way. "I was just," he began, then paused, looking around the coffee shop before settling his gaze back on me. "I've been thinking about you. A lot, actually." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. I had thought about him too, of course. I hadn't stopped thinking about him, even though I had tried. "It's been a while," I said, as if stating, the obvious would somehow make everything less strange. He smiled faintly, but there was something in his eyes that made my breath catch. "It has. I've been trying to figure things out, you know? About us. About everything." I wasn't sure if he meant that as a confession or just an observation. Either way, I didn't know how to respond. We had been through so much, too much, and I wasn't sure I was ready to dive into the depths of it all again. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his gaze searching mine. I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain it all. I didn't know how to say, "I'm okay, but it's taken me so long to get here." Instead, I just nodded. "Yeah, I'm getting there." His lips twitched, the ghost of his old smile appearing. "I'm glad," he said softly. For a moment, we stood in silence, two people who had shared something beautiful once, but who had both changed in ways that couldn't be undone. I wanted to say something, to ask him if he missed me, if he regretted what had happened, but I knew it was pointless. The past was gone. We were both living in a different version of our lives now. "I should go," he said, his voice steady but reluctant. I wanted to see you, to make sure you're okay." "Thank you," I said, the words feeling heavier than I intended. I didn't know if it was gratitude or just the weight of everything that had passed between us. "I'm doing all right." "Good," he said, then paused. "Take care of yourself." "You too," I replied, my voice almost breaking as I spoke. And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd as easily as he had come. I sat there, for a while, processing everything that had just happened. My heart still ached, but it wasn't a sharp, jagged pain anymore. It was more of a dull throb, the kind you get when you've healed enough to remember, but not enough to be overwhelmed. I picked up my coffee cup, now cold, and stared into the dark liquid. It didn't matter that we had come back together in this fleeting moment. What mattered was that I had finally found peace. Not with him, but with myself. I had let go of the things I couldn't change and accepted the things I couldn't control. And in that acceptance, I had found the one thing I had been looking for all along, the ability to move forward. It had been a few weeks since that chance encounter at the coffee shop, and life seemed to have settled into a rhythm that was both new and familiar. There were moments of quiet joy, small moments of happiness that felt earned rather than fleeting. I had learned to build a life that was fully mine, one not defined by a relationship, but by my own decisions, my own desires. It was a strange feeling, one that I hadn't fully appreciated until I found myself living it. I had begun dating again, casually, though it felt almost foreign. It wasn't about finding someone to fill a gap or replace what I had lost. It was about discovering a new side of myself, a side that didn't need validation from another person to feel worthy. I laughed more than I had in years, joked about the absurdities of life, and found a new appreciation for my independence. I wasn't rushing anything, but I was open to the possibility of something new, something better. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that this was the first time in a long time that I wasn't haunted by the past. I was still healing, still learning, but I had come so far from where I had been. The scars were there, but they didn't define me anymore. They were a part of my story, not the whole story. I thought about the letter I had written months ago, the one that had finally allowed me to release him, and in doing so, release myself. That letter was my final act of closure, my way of stepping out of the shadows and into the light of my own life. And though we hadn't spoken since, I knew that our chapter was truly over. But I also knew that I had come to understand something that I had never truly grasped before. Love, in any form, starts with loving yourself. It took a long time to get there, to realize that the healing process wasn't about waiting for someone else to fix what was broken in me, but about fixing it myself. That was the hardest lesson of all, but it was the one that had made all the difference. So here I was, standing on the edge of something new. Not a new love, necessarily, but a new version of me. The version that didn't rely on anyone's approval, the one that didn't need anyone to complete her, the one that was whole. I smiled to myself, feeling a quiet sense of pride that had been so elusive for so long. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was okay with that. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready for whatever came next, and that was enough. For those who have ever found themselves lost in the aftermath of love, know that the journey back to yourself is possible. It's not easy and it's never perfect, but it's worth every step. If you're still in that place, don't give up. You deserve to feel whole again too.